This series is about my former therapist, not my current one. I'm happy to say I no longer have a therapist who's actively trying to ruin my life, but unfortunately, at one point I did, and you guys are about to hear all about it. I think it's important that I give you context. I was 21 years old in my junior year of college studying neuroscience, and I had a full-time job as a nanny. I think it's also important that I highlight the fact that I was 21 years old and as naive as a 21-year-old is, and the therapist in this story was 56 at the time. Not only was I significantly younger than her, but I was vulnerable with the person who I was supposed to be able to be vulnerable with. In sharing this story, I don't want to discourage anyone from starting therapy, because therapy is great when you have the right therapist. But I do want to make you aware that people enter the field of mental health for different reasons, and unfortunately, their intentions are not always good. I ended up with a therapist who manipulated me, took advantage of me, and ruined my life at the time. I'm sharing this story because I've had time to heal from the damage she did, and it's important that others are aware that situations like this can happen. Even though I filed a report against her, my former therapist is still practicing. She's out there. She might be working with one of y'all. So if you live in New Orleans. But anyway, back to the story. I was 21 years old, in college, with a full-time job, and I was stressed out. So I decided to get a therapist, not only to help with the stress, but because I was trying to work my way back to myself. I'd worked as a live-in nanny during COVID, and I'd basically given up my whole life during that time, and I started to deal with some depression. I also wasn't able to have a therapist growing up, so I had a few traumas that I'd never been able to address. So anyways, I decided I was finally ready to start talking to someone. I had a very specific criteria for what I was looking for. My therapist had to be Black, she had to be a woman, and she had to be older than me. I wanted a female therapist because that just made the most sense given some of my life experiences. Specifically a Black woman because I thought that a Black person could better relate to me and understand me and my experiences. And I wanted someone older than me because I've always been a little bit wiser than my peers, so I just wanted someone who was an intellectual match. So I found Lori in my insurance portal and I gave her a call. She answered the phone and I asked her if she was accepting new clients. Lori is not her real name, but it's what we'll refer to her as during this story. She said yes, that she was taking new clients, and I introduced myself and told her that I was looking to start sessions. She told me that she was in the middle of a session, so she'd call me back in a bit. That should have been the first red flag, that she'd taken my call and chatted with me for so long while she was in the middle of a session. But I digress. She called me back a few hours later and we got scheduled for a few weeks out. She told me that she didn't currently have an office. Her sessions were held at a coffee shop that had really nice outdoor seating, or sometimes we'd be able to have sessions sitting on the bayou. It sounded really nice. I imagined us sitting out on the water, talking about life. It should have been another red flag though, that her sessions were held in public places. It should have also been a red flag that the office listed on her profile on my insurance portal was just the address to her apartment complex. I recognized it because I toured those apartments as a potential place to live. But I looked past all of that because I was just so excited to start working on myself. I couldn't wait for our first session. The day of our first session, I was early. I'd scheduled our session for about 30 minutes after work, and the coffee shop was only like 15 minutes away, so I just headed over. I had no idea who I was looking for or what to expect. I did know I was looking for a Black woman, and there were no Black people there when I arrived. I went inside and grabbed my coffee and then picked a table outside that seemed a little bit further away from the rest. I've never been a super open person, and I could not fathom how I'd cry out there in public if I ever needed to do that in one of our sessions. So we definitely wouldn't be making progress on that end. I pulled out my iPad and started doing what I do. Planning, scheduling, organizing. I kept up with a lot of things on a daily basis, and the only way that it all stayed together was if I was on top of it in all the ways, all the time. Before I knew it, 30 minutes had gone by. That meant we were 15 minutes past when we were supposed to meet. If I listened to my internal voice and left right then, I would have saved myself months, even years of trauma. But I texted her, and she showed up 10 minutes later. She walked right over to me with a cup of coffee in her hand, 25 minutes late, and told me some story about her mother and a doctor's appointment and dropping her off at her apartment down the street. I listened and I watched her. She was beautiful and confident. It was stunning. So when she sat down across from me and made eye contact as she lit a cigarette, I just couldn't tell her about my asthma. She asked me what brought me to therapy, and I told her some things like moving because of Katrina and having a father in prison as a child. She smoked the entire time. She asked me about the things that I liked and didn't like about myself. Her response to me was that most of the things that I didn't like about myself were things that I had the power to change. We talked a little bit about my experience living with another family during COVID and how stressful that was. But then we got to my current levels of stress. That was my biggest problem. I was always taking 18 to 21 hours a semester, studying neuroscience while also working 50 hours a week and still trying to maintain a social life. I was so busy and overworked and overwhelmed that sometimes it felt like my head was going to explode. But at the same time, I loved it because I'm such a go-getter. As she listened to me, she took a long draw of her cigarette, and then she looked at me as if she just had an epiphany. She said, "I know you already have so much on your plate, but my friend has been looking for an assistant, and I just know you'd be so perfect for the job. I can see that you're so organized and intelligent and creative, and she needs a young lady just like you." I explained to her a bit more all of the things that I had going on and told her that I just couldn't right now, but she insisted I at least hear her friend out. She said she'd give her friend my phone number so that she could give me a call to just tell me a bit more about the job. She wouldn't tell her friend that she was my therapist. She'd tell her we just met at the coffee shop and started chatting. It was clear that she wasn't going to let it go, and I'm not one to pass up a decent opportunity to make money really easily. So I agreed, and just like that, we'd reached the end of our first session. At that point, there were a lot of red flags, but I was just going with it. Nothing was dangerous yet. I didn't end up taking the assistant job with her friend. In my second session with Lori, she posed the idea that maybe I'd be better off being her assistant because she actually had some things that she could use my help with. She'd fallen behind in her billing and notes, and her files were all out of order. She said she could continue being my therapist, but I would also be her assistant. I was becoming more and more drawn in by her personality. She just had this way of making you want to be around her. She said we'd start with getting her files back in order. One day that week, I'd go over to her house and start with helping to get her organized. I processed that in the meantime, I was going to figure out how to balance this new job with my schoolwork and the job that I already had. As far as my stress levels were concerned, we hadn't been making much progress. We hadn't established a rate for the assistant work, but she said that eventually her biller, who lived out in Texas, would teach me how to do her billing, and I would get a percentage of every claim that I submit. Talking about this plan took up half of our session. I say half of our session because the session did end about 15 minutes later, after we just spent 15 minutes talking about this plan. So somehow, the session for that day only lasted 30 minutes instead of an hour like the first one. But she never said how long the sessions actually were, so I wasn't sure if she'd given me extra time the first time or if she was shorting me this time. We didn't manage to talk much, but she did remind me that she wanted me to start reaching out to her in between sessions by text or call, just whenever I needed her. She said that she would always make herself available, even if it was in the middle of the night. I didn't think it worked that way. I thought we were only supposed to talk during our sessions. She brought up the fact that I hadn't reached out to her at all outside of our scheduled sessions, and then she asked me, "Don't you ever need me?" It was like she wanted me to feel bad about not needing her. The session after that lasted about 40 minutes. We ended up taking a walk down the block a bit away from the coffee shop. When we got to a secluded spot, she turned and faced me and said, "So cut the bullshit. Why are you really here?" I looked at her in disbelief. I had no idea what she was expecting me to say. But then she continued, "We all have stress and things like that, but you keep talking to me about all this surface level shit, and I know you have things that are deeper than that. Otherwise, you don't really need to be having these sessions with me." I felt like she was forcing me to give her something, or she was going to end our sessions. I don't remember which thing I told her, and I'm not going to be going into detail about my personal issues, but I do know that I gave her something for us to start to work on. Towards the end of our session, she reminded me of her plans to set something up for us to start to organize those files at her house. I told her to just let me know when. A few days later, I did need to take her up on her offer to reach out to her when I got depressed. I don't remember what happened, but I know that I was having a really low moment. At that point in life, I'd gotten so used to dealing with my hardest times on my own, and it was really hard for me to reach out to her. I called her and she didn't answer, so I texted her and let her know what was going on. She ended up texting me back later to say that she was watching a football game with her fiance and she wouldn't be able to call me back, but she would see me the following day for another session. I was confused. She just told me she would always make herself available, even if it was late at night. It had been really hard to work up the courage to reach out, and I ended up having to manage on my own anyway. The following day was a Sunday, and she didn't work on Sundays, but she made an exception. But when we met up that morning, I was in a completely different mental space than the night before. I didn't want to talk much about my depression or how I'd been feeling. We ended up chatting about lots of different things, and before I knew it, she said our session time was up, but she'd love to keep chatting with me. My therapist wanted to hang out with me, like as friends. She decided we should leave the coffee shop and go down by the bayou. So I got in my car and drove a few blocks down to the bayou and met her by her car to grab a chair out of the trunk. She turned and waved at somebody behind me. It was her fiance. He was out there grilling, and she'd known he was going to be there, and she brought me there anyway. She introduced me to him as one of her friends from the coffee shop, and the two of us walked down together and sat along by the bayou. She'd basically just told him that I was her client, but I couldn't bring myself to say anything about it. We chatted for a while, and eventually it was time for me to go home. It was over 90 degrees outside, not including the humidity, and I'd been waiting 45 minutes for Lori to show up for our session. She'd been late to every single session and later each time. I hadn't heard from her, and I wasn't sure if she was going to show up. When she walked over to me, I could see the depression on her face. She said she was sorry for being late. She'd never apologized for being late before, so I knew something was wrong. I asked her if she wanted to reschedule. I told her, I don't absolutely have to talk today. It can wait. But she insisted we move forward with the session. It wasn't going well. She was visibly sad, and I couldn't sit there and just talk about me without asking if she was okay. I shouldn't have asked her if she was okay. I think that's when it all started. She paused, as if considering if she should say it or not. And then she did it. She said, I just don't know if I want to get married anymore. And just like that, I'd become immersed in her life. We spent my session talking about her current relationship and her past relationships. She told me about her 3 marriages from before and why each of them hadn't worked out. She told me how her current fiance had cheated on her a few times in the past, and while she didn't suspect him of cheating now, she just didn't know if she really loved him or what she wanted to do. She told me that the following day, her cousin would be coming in town to go dress shopping with her at David's Bridal near my place. I assumed the role of the therapist. I offered her a listening ear, comforting words, and asked her questions to help her come to her own conclusions. And just like that, we'd reached the end of my session. The next day, I called in sick to work. I really had needed to talk about my own problems the day before, and my mental health was starting to decline. This was my first mental health day. At 11 a.m., I got a call from Lori out of the blue to just chit-chat. I was extremely confused. I knew that this wasn't appropriate, and she knew that I was supposed to be at work. She then went on to tell me how her cousins and all of her friends had got tied up in other things, and she really needed someone to go wedding dress shopping with her. And since I lived so close, and I was going to be her assistant anyways, she just thought that maybe I could join her. So an hour later, she pulled up at my apartment complex in her luxury car, and we rode to David's Bridal. It turns out she hadn't actually made an appointment, so they weren't going to let her try anything on. So we were just taking a look around the store, and then some other people walked in. Lori assumed that they didn't have an appointment either, but they were allowed to try on dresses, so she lost it. She must have cussed out everyone in the store. She was like, how come those bitches over there get to try on dresses? They don't have a fucking appointment, but when I walked the fuck up in here, I couldn't try on a fucking dress. Fuck you. That bitch over there can try on a dress, and that bitch over there too. Yeah, bitch, I'm talking about you. She carried on for at least another minute, and I stood there with my mouth wide open. I'd never seen anybody act like that ever in my life. We walked back to the car, and she lit up a cigarette and explained to me how those bitches had her fucked up. I will admit that at this point, I was just starting to get more and more intrigued. I spent the remainder of the day with her. We went to Barnes & Noble and got a wedding planning book and looked at wedding magazines, and then we went back to my place. Though it was her idea to come over, and she picked me up from there. When we got back to my place, she acted like she was hesitant to get out of the car and come into my building. She told me about a client of hers who used to live in my apartment complex. She said, something really bad happened in these apartments, and I'm not going to tell you what it is until you move away from here so that you don't get freaked out. That freaked me the fuck out. I practically begged her to tell me what she was talking about, but she refused. We got out of the car and went into my place and hung out for maybe an hour or so. I had a really nice place, and my life was really well put together for a 21-year-old. I could see that she was becoming even more impressed by me. We sat on the couch and had some wine and talked more about wedding things. She asked me if I really felt safe where I was, living all by myself. I told her I really did feel safe. I knew my neighbors and my community was gated, but she was really making me start to question things. She posed the idea of me moving into the apartments where she lived. She said if I were working as her assistant, it would be so convenient if I could just run across the hall to grab files from her. And it would be much safer because she and her fiance were there and they could watch out for me. It was just so dangerous for young women to be living on their own these days. I considered what she'd said, but I'd only been at my current apartment for 2 months after being displaced because of a rodent infestation at my last place, and I was really happy where I was. She'd also been mentioning this assistant thing for about 2 weeks now, and we'd yet to start doing any work. We talked a bit more about wedding things, and then she went back to her home and left me questioning whether or not I was safe in mine. The following week, she finally asked me to come over to her place to work on some files. I headed over right after work. On the elevator ride up to her apartment, she explained more about her current living situation. This was Lori's home, but her mother had come to stay with her while Lori recovered from spine surgery in the previous year. The mother had yet to return to her own home, and Lori was growing increasingly frustrated by the day. She then looked at me and said, if she wasn't here, you could just move in with me. With all seriousness, like she meant it. I laughed it off, and we kept walking. Her mother was the sweetest lady ever. We had a really quick exchange that first day. She was heading out as Lori and I were heading in. Lori gave me a really quick tour of the place. Her office had boxes and books and papers everywhere. There wasn't even a path to walk into the room. This was the part that she really needed help with, but today's plan was just to start with a handful of files. When we sat at the living room table to get started, her phone rang. She poured us both a glass of wine and gestured to indicate that her call was going to be a while. I could hear things getting heated, and then she hung up. She came back over to the table infuriated. Apparently, her friend Aaliyah had told her cousin Marissa that the story about how Lori injured her back didn't make sense. I said, well, what did your cousin Marissa say when Aaliyah said that to her? Her eyes looked dark and disturbed, just like when we were in David's bridal the other day. She was about to lose it again. She said, I'm gonna call that bitch back and ask her. And she did, and they argued, and she hung up again. And then, as though she had another epiphany, she turned to me and said, Samaj, I just don't know if Aaliyah is really my friend or not, but you seem to be a great judge of character. I want to take you over to her house to meet her, and then I want you to tell me what you think. I said, okay, yeah, when? She meant right then and there, after we finished that bottle of wine and she smoked another cigarette. I was beginning to see that she was a very heavy drinker. She called Aaliyah and asked if she was home and if she wanted to hang out. Aaliyah said yes, so Lori popped open another bottle of wine, poured us both a red Solo cup of it for the road trip over there, and then grabbed another bottle of wine to take with us to Aaliyah's house. I looked at her concerned. This cup is for in the car? She insisted that it was okay. We live in New Orleans. I needed to live a little. So I did. On the way there, she explained to me my role. I was to act as Lori's great niece. She told me the names of my mother, my father, and my siblings. She explained my relation to her and her mother, and that I was supposed to say that she'd taken me under her wing while I was in school in New Orleans, since my parents lived all the way in New York. It was insanity. To one of her friends, I was a girl she met at the coffee shop. To her fiance, I was a friend. To this friend, I was her great niece. I was starting to keep notes in my phone to help me keep all of these stories together. But I played my role flawlessly. Aaliyah, Lori, and I spent hours together that evening, laughing and having a great time. On the way back to Lori's house, I told her friend was a little shady, but she was cool to hang out with. Lori agreed. By the time we made it back to her place, it was really late, and I had work the next morning. I was ready to go home, but Lori asked if I was coming back upstairs. I told her I was gonna drive home, but she asked me to stay there. She said she and her fiance had gotten into an argument and he was gone for the night, so I could just sleep in the bed with her. Or if I wasn't comfortable with that, I could spend the night on her couch. I was super uncomfortable with any of that. She was my therapist, and we'd already crossed so many lines already. I'd gone over to her place to do work, not to hang out. I recognized that working for her was starting to look more and more like an excuse for us to hang out and be friends outside of therapy. I was spending hours of my free time with her, and I'd still yet to have an opportunity to make any money. I told her no thank you, and I'd drive myself home. We would see each other for my session the next day. At this point, I never knew if my scheduled therapy session would be a therapy session for me, a therapy session for her, or some type of hangout session. But it was becoming detrimental to my mental health. My grades were starting to slip, and I was having a hard time at work. She would make me bring up something in therapy that I buried, and then she'd put the plan to address it on pause, but then we'd never come back to it. I was starting to learn a lot about her. She'd had anger issues her whole life. She told me about how sometimes she'd get so angry and lose control, and no one could physically stop her when this happened. I made a mental note to remain on her good side. I learned that she suffered from a crack addiction while in college, and that it was a long journey for her to become a therapist. She had a lot of shit of her own to work through. Outside of our sessions, I was becoming more and more wrapped up in her life. We went shopping together, we went out to bars. She introduced me to more of her friends, as her friend, or her niece, or her assistant. We'd begin to spend every day together. There was finally a day where we actually did some work. We worked on a file for one client specifically. I don't remember why she had to get that particular client's file in order right away. I think it was some insurance thing, but I could not believe the things that she had me put in that file about her client. Her summary of the session contained so much detail about the client's personal business, line by line. She wasn't just sharing it with me. She was sharing it with the insurance company. She was sharing it with her mother, who was in the kitchen fixing her food while Lori was telling me what to type. With her fiance, who was coming in and out of the room while we were working. Her complete disregard for confidentiality was disgusting. That same evening, she ended up taking a virtual session over Zoom, and she let me sit and watch and listen to the whole thing. She didn't wear headphones or anything. I knew the full name of the client, where she lived, and I could visibly see her while she poured her heart out to this therapist who would occasionally turn to me to mock her. Lori sat there in her usual fashion, smoking a cigarette while on camera. She motioned for me to open up a new bottle of wine, and I did. We'd go through at least 2 bottles a day. When we finished up the notes that evening, she sent me some random amount of money. Because like I said in a previous video, we'd never established a rate for the assistant work. Before I went home that night, she let me know that she thought it was about time that I helped her get caught up on her billing. She'd wanted her biller to teach me how to do things in person. So we would be taking a road trip to Texas. My therapist was taking me on a road trip to Texas. I think now is a good time to talk about the things that had rapidly changed in my life. My anxiety had grown exponentially. I was becoming terrified of living alone, and it seemed like every chance she got, Lori was telling me how much I needed to move, how much safer it would be if I just moved into the building where she lived. It was getting to me. On the way to work one morning, my car had broken down, and at this point it had been in the shop for 3 weeks, with no repair date in sight. Between the car issues, being sick, and at this point days that I was just mentally a mess, I was missing work more and more frequently. But I did ask my boss for the time off to take the trip to Texas, and she agreed. The plan was that we would leave the Friday before Memorial Day and then return the day of, so I'd only be taking that Monday, Memorial Day, off from work. There were a lot of ways that Lori justified taking me on this road trip to her friends and family. She had this severe fear of driving over bridges, so she said that her assistant would drive her. At this point, everyone knew me as her assistant. Whether I was her friend or her niece, I was also her assistant. The only rule was that no one could know I was her client. She stressed this to me often, and she told me about how she could lose her license if I ever told anyone. So I could never tell, not even my closest friends and family. This was our secret. Another way that she justified this trip was that she needed me to learn how to do her billing. She'd made a few attempts to set up a time for her biller to teach me over Zoom, but he was unreliable, which is why she needed me to learn how to do her billing in the first place. So he was going to teach me in person. That's the main reason I agreed to go on the trip. There were also some errands that needed to be ran while we were there, and I was to keep her on track and on schedule. She explained these justifications to me as well, in one of the frequent discussions that she had with me about our dual relationship. She wrapped it up with her usual line of, "I just would never want to be unethical." The day we were leaving for Texas, she was supposed to pick me up from work, so my boss agreed that I could just hang out at the house until she showed up. As I sat there waiting for her, completely embarrassed by just how long I'd been waiting, I couldn't help but think that maybe she wasn't going to show up, like one of the days earlier that week when she'd said she'd pick me up from work and then she just never came. That day, I'd ended up walking to a nearby coffee shop and just sitting there waiting for her to save myself the embarrassment until she texted me an hour later saying she wasn't going to be able to make it, and I ended up just Ubering home. She was increasingly becoming more unpredictable. She would volunteer to do something for me or to help me with something, and then she would just leave me waiting and never show up. But she did show up that day for the road trip to Texas. She was just 2 whole hours late. When she pulled up, my boss was out on the front porch, pushing the baby in a swing. Lori was on her phone in the car, loudly cussing at someone. I waved to my boss, put my suitcase in the trunk, and then headed off with Lori, completely embarrassed about this whole situation. Since Lori had canceled my lunchtime session earlier that day, I thought we'd talk on the drive. But it seemed like every time I attempted to talk about the things that were going on with me or my feelings, she shut it down. We ended up listening to music and not talking. She slept for almost the entire time, and I drove the whole way. As I drove, I reflected on the fact that I thought that being friends with my therapist meant I'd always have a therapist available to me. But Lori had not been being a therapist at all. In fact, a lot of my current frustrations were caused by her, and it's not like I could talk to her or anyone else about it. I was feeling even more on my own while having a therapist than I did before I started working with her. The traffic made the drive take 8 hours, but eventually we made it. Her cousin Marissa welcomed us into her home, gave each of us a hug, and showed us to our respective bedrooms, and we each went to bed for the night. I woke up early because I was so excited to finally learn how to do billing. The extra income was going to be great. I went downstairs and sat at the kitchen table planning to read until everyone woke up. Marissa came out of her room first and saw the perfect opportunity to get to know me. We talked about how I'd met Lori one day when I was studying at the coffee shop. We talked about school and working as a nanny and as Lori's assistant. Then Lori woke up. I really hoped I'd been telling the correct story. I didn't think I was supposed to tell Lori's cousin that I was Lori's great niece. I was right. I didn't learn to do billing that day. We went wedding dress shopping at a place where Lori actually had an appointment, and then we went out for lunch. That day was full of errands, like handling her car registration and getting her new plate put on. Though she lived in New Orleans, her vehicle was registered in Texas at her cousin Marissa's house. It turns out the actual reason she needed to be in Texas that weekend was to clear up some things regarding that. It was a long day with lots of drinking. When we made it back to the house, I think I was visibly stressed. I'd been getting like that lately. She offered me a cigarette. I told her no thank you. She knew I didn't smoke those. We ended up hanging out in her room for a few hours that evening, just watching TV and talking. I asked her if she thought maybe I should get a new therapist. She just asked me what I thought, and I really wasn't sure. She was the therapist. I thought that maybe she could help me figure that out. I was ready for bed. I told her good night, and she said, "Why don't you sleep in the room with me tonight?" She said that we could sleep with our feet by each other's heads if that would make me more comfortable. I told her no, and that I would sleep in my own room, as politely as I could. This was her second time asking me something like that. The next day, Marissa, Lori, and I spent a lot of time together. The tension between the two of them over those last 2 days had been insane. The three of us had just finished an entire bottle of vodka, and they were arguing over something. I was fed up, and finally I said, "That is enough. Sit down, right here, right now." Lori giggled and said something to Marissa about how I work with kids all day, but I was serious. I told them, I said, "No, I'm serious. Y'all are gonna sit here and we're gonna figure all of this out right now." And they sat down. We sat right there on that kitchen floor, and I ran what had to be the best drunk therapy session ever. By the end of it, they were hugging me and thanking me for helping them to get back to the way things used to be between them. Later that evening, I took a few pictures and a video of them dancing and having a good time by the pool. I was planning to send them to Lori later so that she'd have a few memories of that night. She saw me, and just like before, her eyes got dark and disturbed. She came over to me and asked me what the fuck I was doing. She told me maybe we needed to end things. Maybe I was manipulating her and trying to ruin her. She said she needed to think about what she was going to do. I went to my room and cried so hard. I sent her a really long text explaining myself. I was reminding her that I'd been a photographer for years and capturing memories was really just kind of my thing. I'd never want to do anything to ruin our relationship. I was in that room crying my eyes out, and I didn't have anyone to talk to. She was the person I was supposed to be able to talk to, and she'd just broken me. She didn't text me back. I stayed in my room hating myself, wanting to go home, wanting to end my life. I managed to calm myself down eventually. I ended up needing to go back downstairs a little later to get some water, and she came right over to me and hugged me and asked me to stay downstairs and hang out with them. So I did, and it was like nothing had happened at all. She went right back to treating me like I was her favorite person in the world, and she loved me so much. That night, when she asked me to sleep in the bed with her, I didn't refuse. Although I didn't want to, I didn't want to do anything to mess things up again. I didn't want a repeat of what happened earlier. My therapist and I ended up staying in Texas for 2 additional days because I'd gotten too sick to drive us back to New Orleans. I think I had COVID, but the doctors didn't COVID test me because I was newly vaccinated. And apparently Lori just couldn't overcome that fear of bridges enough to drive us back on her own. So we had to stay until I was well enough to drive us back. This meant even more time off from work. I never got paid for any of the time that we spent in Texas, and I never learned how to do billing while we were there either. For her, this trip had been a fun getaway with a friend. For me, it was a loosening of the control I had over my life. When we did get back in town, I still wasn't fully recovered, but my boss was desperate for me to get back to work. She even offered me a room to sleep in throughout the day while the baby napped, since I was still so sick. Lori remained unpredictable and undependable. She would promise to pick up my medicine and drop it off at my house, or offer to bring me soup for dinner, but then she would just never show up. That week and the following week were rough, and by the end of all of it, I was spiraling. Lori offered me solutions to all of my current problems. In regards to my car issues, she said that I should go and get myself a brand new car, or Mercedes, like hers. She said I could afford it, especially once I started doing her billing. I deserved it. I worked so hard, and I needed to start doing nice things for myself. She said the anxiety that I was feeling, that was because I knew that she'd been right about my current living situation. I should break my lease and move into her building. She was my therapist. She would write a letter to my apartment complex asking them to let me out of my lease for mental health purposes. The depression that I was feeling, that was because I was being underpaid. Even though I was missing lots of work, I was still phenomenal when I was there. They should give me a raise or I should quit. She knew she'd caught me at the perfect moment for all of this.
She was exploiting my irrational mental state. On a typical day, I make sound, rational decisions. But every now and then, I slip into a state of mind where I'm impulsive and I make reckless decisions. As my therapist, she was well aware of this. She was literally feeding me ways to self sabotage, and I was just trusting her judgment. So, in the same day, I dropped off letters from both her and myself to my leasing office, requesting to be let out of my lease in a month with no place secured to move, and I went out and got myself a $30,000 car as a 22-year-old college student. In the following days, I came back to my senses and realized the damage that I'd done. But there was no undoing it. I could only move forward. I submitted an application and got approved to move into the apartments where Lori lived. I'd have to downgrade from a 2-bedroom to a 1-bedroom with a much less luxurious appeal, but at the same price. But supposedly I would feel safer. Lori and her fiance would be there to watch over me. I had this beautiful new car that I loved, but my insurance was more than half of the car note. One thing was for sure. I was going to need to ask my boss for that raise. My summer classes were kicking my butt. I was planning a move, navigating new expenses, and trying to work up the courage to ask my boss for a raise. Life felt insane, and my therapy sessions were basically non-existent. We'd schedule them, and I'd show up only to have to listen to what was going on in Lori's life. This week, she and her fiance were splitting up, and it was official. Though my life felt in shambles, the entire focus had to be on her relationship. On top of that, the apartments she'd convinced me to move into, to be closer to her, she was now planning to move out of them, around the same time that I was supposed to move in. When she told me that, I screamed on the inside. But I just listened, and I went with her to tour houses and apartments, though there was one place in particular that piqued her interest. It had 2 separate units. Upstairs was a 2-bedroom apartment with floor-to-ceiling mirrors, a jacuzzi, and an elevator from the garage. Downstairs was a 1-bedroom unit with no windows and a bathroom that reminded me of a prison. This is the one that she wanted. She said it would be perfect for us. The downstairs unit cost the same as what I was already paying in rent. She said that I would move downstairs and she would take the upstairs unit. She didn't ask me for my opinion or if that was something I wanted to do. She made plans for us to view the unit again the following week and sign leases. That weekend, Lori asked me to attend a wedding reception with her and her friend. Carol and I were only there to support Lori since her ex-fiance, Wayne, wouldn't be attending. But when the 2 of us got there, Wayne and Lori were already in each other's arms, completely made up. I was infuriated. I couldn't wrap my head around her taking him back after his infidelities. It was triggering. The few therapy sessions that we'd had at this point had mostly been about my father and his infidelities and my mother's willingness to constantly take him back. This also added more confusion to my future living arrangements. Were we still going to move to the new place? Was I supposed to move into her current apartments? I wanted to just go home at this point, but I hadn't driven myself there. I rode with Carol, and she'd left for a family event, so Lori was my ride. So I stayed and watched as they continued on as though nothing had ever happened. And I listened later as Lori explained to me that they were back together and I should forget all that she'd said about Wayne and his mistreatment of her. He was moving back in that night. She told me how Wayne had really grown to care about me like a daughter. He'd decided that he wanted to take Lori and I out for breakfast the next morning on Father's Day. This was pretty triggering for me. Sometimes I felt as if Lori was playing pretend. She often suggested that I could be her child. As a teenager, she'd gotten pregnant and her mother forced her to put the child up for adoption, and she'd never gotten closure from that situation. In fact, she often talked about how I was around the age that her daughter would be. But I agreed to brunch and I ended up sleeping on the couch at their place that night. We had plans to spend all of Father's Day together, like some kind of twisted family. I was spending Father's Day with my therapist and her fiance. Lori, Wayne, and I got all dressed up and went to Katie's for brunch. Everything was back to normal between the 2 of them. They were holding hands, telling me all about this, speaking to me as if they were my parents, telling me about their rekindled relationship. I took full advantage of the mimosas being constantly refilled. A few hours later, we made our way to a seafood boil at Lori's friend Aaliyah's house. It was all going decently until Lori pulled me inside to have a private conversation. She said, I've been thinking. It's Father's Day. I know you and your dad haven't spoken for years. I want you to reach out to him and tell him Happy Father's Day. She'd decided that it was time for me to reconnect with my father. She said, you call him and you tell him you'd like to try to establish a relationship where you take turns. You're going first, so next time it's his turn to reach out, and you'll continue on like this. I wasn't ready for that, and my father and I weren't on speaking terms for good reasons, but I did as she asked because she wasn't giving me a choice. I prayed that my father wouldn't answer the phone, but he did, and we set up the arrangement as I was instructed. I hated vulnerable conversations, and she just forced me to have one that I wasn't ready for right in front of her. Not long after that, Lori and I ended up making a quick drive back to her place, and we ended up having another conversation. At that point in life, my baby fever had been strong. I'd frequently mentioned to her how much I wanted to be a mother, but that I knew I needed to be responsible and wait. She said, Samaj, if you really want to have a baby right now, I think that you should go ahead and do it. I mean, Wayne and I would be happy to support you and the baby while you finish school. I was shocked. I said, would you really do that? There really was nothing that I wanted more than to have a baby. But then she said the most devastating thing I'd ever heard. She said, you would just need to sign over your rights to the baby, of course. I mean, Wayne and I would need to be the baby's legal parents. My heart dropped. She wanted me to give her my baby? That didn't make any sense at all. Why would I do that? I didn't say anything. I just let her finish talking about this perfect arrangement she'd made in her head, where we all lived together and she and her fiance raised my baby. When we got back to the seafood boil, the first thing I noticed was an older man that I had talked to earlier, staring off into the distance, not moving at all and completely drenched in sweat. When I walked over to him and asked if he was okay, he didn't respond. I began to check him for a pulse, and it was so weak that I couldn't find it at first. He needed to go to the hospital. Someone needed to call an ambulance. I told the lady next to me to call someone, and Lori's friend Aaliyah came over to me screaming at me as if I'd done something wrong. She said, nobody's calling the fucking paramedics. He's just fine. I tried to explain his symptoms to her and anyone else, but no one was listening to me. When I went inside and told Lori that Aaliyah was refusing to call for help, she became enraged. She stormed outside and confronted Aaliyah and told her that he needed to go to the hospital. They were in each other's faces. Aaliyah yelled at her, is anybody in here a fucking doctor? No, you're a therapist, not a fucking doctor. It all happened so quickly. Lori reached both of her hands up and locked them around Aaliyah's neck, choking her. I stood frozen, watching. Wayne grabbed Lori and dragged her to the car. I followed and we sat in the car while Lori calmed down and the paramedics arrived. When I got out to grab my things from in the house, the man's wife thanked me for taking notice of what was going on with him. As we headed back to the apartment, Lori explained to me the reasoning behind her rage. She said that if he had died while she was there and she hadn't done anything, that would have made her look irresponsible. There had been drugs involved, and she could have potentially lost her license. We spent the rest of the day drinking, and I listened as she called each of her friends, telling them the drama of her and Aaliyah's falling out. Later into the evening, the old man's wife had called Lori and asked if I could come by the hospital to see him. So we went. He told me I'd saved his life. I was thankful that his wife had listened to me and called the paramedics in the midst of all of that drama. I ended up staying on Lori's couch that night. I didn't sleep much. The following morning, I was an emotional wreck. I was replaying the conversation I'd been forced to have with my father. I couldn't stop thinking about what Lori had said to me about having a child and giving her custody of it. And I kept seeing that old man's face in my head, sitting there nearly lifeless with no one paying attention. I was also replaying the scene of Lori choking her friend in front of me. My therapist was right beside me and I couldn't talk to her about any of the things that were bothering me. They were all problems that she'd brought into my life. And when she woke up, all she wanted to talk about was her fight with her friend. We stayed in her bed all day. I slept through a deep, depressive episode while she gossiped on the phone beside me. I tried my best to explain to my boss why I needed the last-minute day off through a text that morning. I'd saved a man's life the day before. It was traumatic. I was shaken up. I knew she'd still be upset about it. When I showed up for work the following morning, she gave me a week's notice. I'd loved her children as my own, and just like that, they were no longer going to be a part of my life. Everything had fallen apart. I was going to have to move out of my apartment in a few weeks. I was stuck with this new car note. My grades were plummeting, and now I'd just lost my job. I'd lost everything. I needed my therapist to be a therapist now, but she'd become a monster. Earlier in the day, when I texted her about how upset I was, she told me to stop with the bullshit. She said I'd complained to her about being underpaid, and I'd mentioned possibly finding another job, so she didn't want to hear it. When I went over to her house after work that evening, she was still talking about the same shit, her fight with her friend, how upset she was about all of it. I didn't want to hear any of that. She didn't seem to care about anything that was going on with me, or that mentally I was a wreck. So I told her I'd see her the next day, and I headed out. I was dealing with really strong suicidal ideations, and I didn't feel like I could safely drive myself home, so I decided to just stop and take a walk. Lori's apartments were across the street from a very popular park with lots of foot traffic, so even though it was nighttime, I felt like I was fine to take a walk. It definitely felt safer than the alternative. So I texted Lori and I let her know that that's what I was doing, just so that someone knew where I was. That's when she called me, yelling, "You're bipolar as fuck. What the fuck is wrong with you taking a walk by yourself at night like that? Are you crazy? You're fucking crazy." I was speechless. I don't have a bipolar diagnosis, but in one of our therapy sessions, I told Lori all about how when I was in high school, my mother used to call me bipolar as an insult. And so for a long time, I was really left wondering if I was bipolar. So she knew that her telling me this was going to be super hurtful. "Go home," she demanded. And then she hung up on me. And I sat in my car for an hour before I drove home. And even then, I couldn't guarantee that I wouldn't intentionally run into anything. When I got home, I wrote letters to my family and friends explaining how much I loved and appreciated each of them. I stopped when I got to one that was for a kid. What would I say to a kid? So I ripped the letters up, and I cried until I fell asleep next to all the papers on my living room floor. The next morning, I sent Lori a text message apologizing to her, asking her to not be upset with me. She'd really made me feel like I'd done something wrong by taking a walk to calm down. How dare I do that without permission? What was I thinking? Throughout the day, she didn't text and call me like she usually did. When I texted her, she didn't respond. It felt like something had changed. Things continued that way on Thursday, which ended up being my last day of work. I was not taking it well. When I got off, I called her and she didn't answer. When I texted her to confirm our plans for the next day, she didn't respond. I had an interview set for that Friday afternoon, and we were supposed to get our nails done that morning. When it was time for us to meet up, she didn't answer the phone, and she didn't show up for our appointment. She didn't return my texts either. But when I showed up at Starbucks to interview with the new family, she was there. It was super uncomfortable running into her like that. She came over to me, gave me a side hug, and then left. After my interview, I tried calling her. She texted me back saying she'd prefer to just text. This went on for days, her barely talking to me. She even had her friend Carol call and tell me to give her some space. I was so confused. Then, finally, that Sunday morning, she called me. I returned her energy and responded via text instead. I was out for lunch. I'd call her later. She sent me this long message saying, "By the way, please look in your belongings. Wayne said I had my shades in the car after we left the seafood boil last Sunday. That's what I remember too, and I cleaned the car out and the purse that I was carrying was empty. I've looked everywhere, so if by chance you come across them, please let me know. Thanks." We'd gone 2 places after leaving the seafood boil that Father's Day. Walgreens and then the hospital to visit the old man. I responded, "Okay, I'll check, but I would have remembered if I picked them up. Is there any chance you took them into the hospital? Or did you have them with you when you went to the bathroom in Walgreens?" She responded, "No, I lost both pairs, the black ones and my Ray-Bans that were in the case, so I wouldn't have had both pairs in Walgreens or the hospital. And they were both in the front." "The front as in your living/dining room?" I responded. I started to panic. Did she think I'd taken them? She didn't respond, so I sent another text. I called earlier to ask if you could let me know about the next trip to Texas by tomorrow. If we aren't going, I need to make plans for what makes sense for the rest of the week once I get my things moved into storage. We'd been planning another trip to Texas, and we were supposed to leave the day after I moved out of my current place. She responded, "Do what you need to do for you. I'm good regarding Texas. Thanks." I froze. What happened? I asked her if I'd done something wrong, to which she responded, "Nope, just taking time for things that are family-oriented." I asked if I'd see her before I headed back to Atlanta, which is where I'd be staying until I moved into my new place. She said, "Maybe. If not, I'll see you when you get back." I was immediately triggered. She was abandoning me. This scenario was very similar to one that we discussed in one of my therapy sessions. I was only leaving for a few weeks, but it felt like it was going to be forever, and she wasn't even going to see me to say goodbye. It was 8 a.m. Monday morning when she called me, and she had me on speakerphone with Carol in her car. She asked me again if I had her glasses, this time also asking me about a watch. As I began to tell her how I didn't have her things, but I'd even checked my bag from that day again, Carol interrupted me. She was yelling, "Yes, you do. You know you have her stuff." I denied having her things, but promised to take another look when I got back home. When we got off the phone, I texted her saying, "Please tell me you know that I would never steal." To which she responded, "Check every bag you had from Sunday. Look for my sunglasses and my black band watch." I did look, but I knew I didn't have her things. I was coming to the realization that it was time for me to get another therapist. By the time Lori called to apologize, I'd already scheduled an appointment with a new therapist, and I'd told my new therapist why we needed to have a session right away. I didn't tell her everything, but I told her that Lori had been my therapist and I'd been working as her assistant, and that she'd accused me of stealing some things from her house the last time I slept over. That was enough. We were set to have a session the following day. Less than an hour later, Lori called me to apologize. Although her apology wasn't much of an apology at all. She said that she didn't mean to hurt my feelings, but she didn't apologize for accusing me of stealing from her. I think she'd come to realize that with how badly she was treating me, at some point I was going to tell someone what was going on. By the time she reached out, though, it was too late. In that same call, she told me she'd decided that she wouldn't be submitting any of the billing for the sessions that she'd had with me. When I asked her why, she said, "I've been thinking about this relationship that we have, and in the long run, I just don't want this to come back and be a big problem for me. I just feel like it would be better if I didn't submit anything for you." So, there would be no record of her having been my therapist in the first place. The following day, Lori's missing things were returned to her. It turns out she left them at Aaliyah's house during all of the Father's Day drama. She texted me a picture of her things, letting me know, and then she called me laughing about it like the whole situation was hilarious. After this, she went back to texting and calling me like normal. She was inviting me over to drink and do edibles and go swimming. I just went along with it. My first session with my new therapist went well, but I was so careful about what I disclosed in regards to Lori. I didn't want to get her in trouble, but I did need to talk about some of the things that happened. The rest of the week went by quickly. I took my final exams, packed up my whole apartment by myself, and got my things moved into storage. Lori had offered to help me with packing, but of course she never showed up. Once everything was done, I headed off to Atlanta, planning to move into my new apartment just before school in August. While I was out of Lori's reach, she called and texted me all day, every day. She couldn't wait for me to be back in town. She missed me so much. It was so weird for her not seeing me every day. I was missing my home and the life that I had before her. When I was on vacation in South Carolina with some family friends, she decided it was finally time for me to learn how to do her billing. She'd successfully set up a 3-hour-long Zoom meeting for me, her, and her biller. He taught me the basics of everything, and she requested that I do some billing for her right away. This took away some of the time that I should have been using to recover from the chaos. At about 11 p.m. one night, she called me. She and Wayne had decided to elope, and she was getting married the next day. I absolutely had to drive back to New Orleans right away to be there. I didn't go. I wasn't just up and leaving from my vacation. I told her I was happy for her, but she was extremely upset with me. Of course, this wedding didn't happen, and a week later, they were splitting up again. This time, she was heartbroken, devastated. She needed me. She said that I needed to come back to New Orleans as soon as possible to be there for her. I did end up going back that time. It was mid-July, and I had a few things to get straightened out with my car and school. When I got there, Lori cried for a while. We went out to a few bars, and Carol and I consoled her as best as we could. And the next day, she was fine. She said she needed me to do some billing for her, and I could tell something was up because she was super hesitant to give me the file. And then she gave me her line about not wanting to be unethical. But she followed it up with telling me that she felt like she had to do this because she was under some financial stress. The file she handed me was for her friend Carol and Carol's son. Lori was asking me to submit months worth of billing as though she'd been seeing the two of them as clients. She was asking me to commit fraud, and I was not about to get wrapped up in that. I told her I didn't remember how to submit billing for that specific insurance company and that she'd have to ask her other biller to do it. So she did. After that, I went back to Atlanta for another 2 weeks. While there, I was starting to realize that I wouldn't be ready to move into a new place at the start of the next semester after all. I had no idea what I was going to do. Lori did, though. On a phone call, she told me she'd been thinking about it for a while. I would move in with her. After all, she did have 3 bedrooms. She promised that by the time I came back in town, she would have the office cleaned up enough for me to put an air mattress in there. At this point, I didn't have another option. I had to take my classes in person, and I didn't have anywhere else to stay. So I agreed. When I came back to New Orleans a few weeks later, of course she hadn't cleaned out the office. I was going to be living on the couch in her living room. I could only sleep when Lori was ready to leave out of the front of the house for the night. She would sit in the front room until 3 in the morning sometimes, laughing and screaming on the phone with all of the lights on. I'd be laying in my pajamas on the couch trying to sleep because I had a 9 a.m. class, and she would get louder if it started to look like I was getting too comfortable. It was maddening. In the afternoons, after class, both Lori and her fiance, who was now back in the picture, had work things that they needed me to help them with. Lori needed me to do her notes and files and billing. Wayne had a plumbing business and was now teaching an online class, and he had no idea how to schedule Zoom meetings or send emails or anything like that. I was putting in hours of work for each of them every day and being paid like $20 or $30 here and there. I was also back in school and starting to pick up my virtual tutoring. The first day I had to tutor at Lori's house, I started to clear some of the boxes out of the way into the office so that there was a walkway into there. She asked me what I was doing, and I explained to her that I planned to take my tutoring session in there where it was quiet. She insisted I didn't have to do that, and she promised that once I started tutoring for the day, she wouldn't make noise in the living room or get on the phone or anything like that. So I listened to her, and I got all set up at the living room table. And literally the second I started my session, she sat in front of me and she called someone and started yelling and screaming on the phone louder than she usually did. She looked directly at me while she did it. I apologized to the kid and grabbed my things and went into the office and ended up finding a spot on the floor in there so that I could finish tutoring him. But I was so embarrassed. Later that evening, Lori decided she needed to sit down with me and have this serious conversation. Literally the day I moved in, I asked her how much I needed to pay her to stay there because I obviously did not expect to stay anywhere for free. But she never gave me a price, and every time I would bring it up to her, she would just brush it off and change the subject. And now here she was telling me that she and Wayne had both been discussing the fact that I'm staying at their house for free, but they're both paying me to do this work for them. And so she decided that I should do all of this work for them every day and they shouldn't have to pay me at all since I'm living there. Basically, I should be available to work for them whenever they needed me for free. So then I reminded her how I'd been offering to pay to stay there and that she'd never told me how much I needed to pay her. And she was like, okay, well, I'm gonna think about it. And so I left the house to go talk to my actual therapist. Over the weeks that we'd been working together, I'd brought up Lori sparingly, but now I was ready to tell my new therapist everything. I'd reached my breaking point. I opened up more about how we'd gotten to the point of me living on Lori's couch. I told her what Lori had said about me living there and working for them and no longer being paid for it. I told her about how I'd been being treated. We established that I needed to get out of that house and I needed to get away from Lori. She was dangerous. Thankfully, I'd already been planning to evacuate the next day because there was a storm coming. Hurricane Ida saved my life. I ended up back in Atlanta for what I expected to be a few days, but my classes ended up becoming remote and it stayed that way for a whole month, so I was able to just stay where I was.
And Lori, she knew she'd messed up. She called me nonstop while I was gone, telling me how much she missed me and cared about me, how she didn't mean it like that, what she'd said about me staying with them. She even went as far as to say that if they had charged me rent, she would have given it back to me the moment I moved out. She was saying anything to get me back in her grasp, but I was not going for it. When school resumed in person, I was offered on-campus housing with the other students who'd been displaced by the hurricane. I told Lori that that's where I would be staying, and she was so disappointed about it. She'd really expected me to come back to her place. After that, I pulled away as best as I could. I stopped responding to her text messages. I missed her calls. Eventually, they died down to every other week or so. But one day, in like mid-November, she called me, and I answered the phone. She updated me about how she and Wayne were back together after another breakup. They were finally getting married. They'd just bought a new house. They'd just gotten the cutest dog. Work was really picking up for her. Her mother had gone back to New York and her life was just going so perfectly. She said the only thing that she was missing was me. She told me that the new house had a bedroom for me if I was ever willing to come back. When I hung up, I cried. Her life was coming together perfectly while I had been left with only a shell of what mine was. I was living in a dorm with 5 other people, barely passing my classes and questioning what I had done to deserve my whole life falling apart. I was falling into what became a very deep depression. The housing on campus was only through the end of the semester. Once it was time for winter break, I was homeless again, back in Atlanta, crashing with the family friends I'd worked for during COVID. I spent those weeks trying desperately to find my way back to myself. But I just couldn't. It felt impossible to even get out of the bed. I didn't want to keep going. When it was time to go back to school, I had to borrow money to be able to rent a room at a house not too far away from campus. That semester, Lori contacted me a few times. She asked me to come over to her house one day while she had to work so someone could be there while the carpets were cleaned. She asked me to do a photo shoot for her new dog. She told me that it was her mom's birthday and that her mom really missed me and wanted to hear from me, and so she sent me her mom's phone number. I said no every time. The phone calls didn't stop until February of 2022 when I finally worked up the courage to tell her to stop contacting me. She'd called me on my way back from a work trip, and when I saw my phone ringing, I had a panic attack. I knew then that it was time to say something. So when the phone stopped ringing, I texted her, letting her know that I knew that everything that she'd done was wrong and that she needed to never contact me again. She responded to my text saying, "Excuse me?" I didn't reply. I spent a lot of that semester working and trying to get my mental health back in order. I was working overnight as a night nurse for newborns, tutoring in the afternoons, and babysitting for families here and there. I was pushing myself so hard to get back to where I was before. But it wasn't sustainable. Things started to fall apart. My depression was getting worse. I would lay in bed for hours, unable to sleep. Other times, I'd sleep for 18 hours and wake up and still feel exhausted. My body ached. Everything felt impossible. I stopped showing up to my classes. My professors were emailing me in the school counseling services. Soon after that, I had to withdraw from school. I'd only had 3 weeks of classes left, but I just couldn't keep going. I was barely keeping myself alive. My focus needed to shift to my mental health. It has been 3 years since I withdrew from school, and I've come a long way since then. I have my own place again, and it's even better than the one I had before I met Lori. I still have my beautiful car that I love very much, and I have an amazing therapist who has helped me to grow in so many ways. When I first began my therapy journey, I was young and naive. Lori was able to shake up my life in the ways that she did because she was in a position of power and I didn't know myself. I went to her lost and looking for direction, and she was able to mislead me. Even though therapy is supposed to be a safe space to find yourself in whatever ways you need to, I've learned that it's very important to at least know what your values are and what you stand for before putting yourself in such a vulnerable position. Therapy can be helpful, and I'm such a huge advocate for it, but I also know that not all therapists are safe. I hope that listening to my story has helped you in some way. If you're about to begin your therapy journey, I hope you've learned some red flags to look out for, and I hope you really took to heart what I said about getting to know your values first. Therapy has gone amazing for me since I started with my new therapist a few years ago, but the first time around, therapy ruined my life. I've managed to completely rebuild my life, and honestly, it is so much better than it was before I met her. I can say that as much as I've healed from my experience, there is one thing that still affects me, and that's knowing that she's out there still practicing, despite what she did to me and despite the fact that I reported her. She is a licensed clinical social worker, so I reported her to her licensing board, the Louisiana Board of Social Work Examiners. In my report, I told the entire story that I've told you here on TikTok. I was contacted shortly after by the board when I submitted my report, and they had a private investigator interview me. And then when we finished the interview, he said that he would be interviewing her as well to hear her side of things. And I received an email that said that within 3 months I would receive some type of update. It's been 3 years since I reported her, and they have not updated me. I've managed to get them on the phone a couple of times, and all they can tell me is that there's an open investigation, lawyers are involved, and she is allowed to continue practicing until whatever happens, whatever decision's made. They said that if the case moves forward, I'll be subpoenaed as a witness, but that she gets due process and the right to continue being a therapist despite everything that I said she did. And maybe one day this case will finally be over, however they're investigating it or whatever they have going on, and she will lose her license, but they'll have allowed her to continue damaging other people's lives for 3 years since I made my report. I will not be naming her here on my TikTok. I will not be sharing photos of her, simply to not open myself up for any type of legal situation. I think the best way to really help if you are looking to support and help her lose her license is to maybe help my story spread. I can't give you her license number or anything because I would be doxing her. But I think if the board saw that this story was gaining traction, they would actually want to do something about it. So anyway, thank you for listening to My Therapist is a Psychopath, and thank you for all of you who have sent me words of encouragement or who just took the time to listen to my whole story. That really means a lot to me. I will continue to make content like I've been doing. I will keep you updated if anything changes. And yeah, thank you for listening.